I thought for a long time that I could answer any problem as an architect through design. And what I found out is that's actually true, but sometimes it's not designing a building, it's actually designing a financial model. And it's interesting. Congratulations to everyone in the room, because we are now officially the wealthiest country per capita in the world. And we have over 120,000 homeless people in this country. And apparently we have the broadest distribution of wealth in any developed country. We just haven't distributed it quite well enough. So I think as a society we've got some work to do. This is Melbourne. I think you were very polite, Ken, when you talked about, Melbourne. We're growing by over 100,000 Melburnians every year. In 10 years, we'll be bigger than Sydney. And by 2050, we'll be at 8 million people. So we're currently at 5 million people. One of the precedents that Ken kindly showed was the Commons, which was a building that we designed in 2007 after the Kevin 07 election. And he was elected in 2007 with a resounding majority based on the idea that he would put a tax on carbon. And what we know now is that the only way that we're actually going to resolve carbon emissions is through market forces. At the end of the 2007 election, the local polling booth in Brunswick voted over 30% for Green. And we thought it was a kind of a threshold moment. And it seemed like that was the place where perhaps we should look to start working on Rob Adams and his city design team work around Melbourne, where they'd said that perhaps the answer to this growing Melbourne was not at the city's edges, in Mickleham or in Melton, and perhaps it wasn't in the city in a kind of, in a 80-storey tower, but perhaps it was in the middle, and perhaps it was along major transport routes, and so they found precedents from around the world. And so we decided that we would build what Rob Adams and his team had been talking about next to a train station in Brunswick. And it's located right next to Anstey Station, next to the Upfield bike path, next to the 503 bus, next to the 19 tram. And the idea was that we would deliver a triple bottom line apartment building, and we would deliver that through an exercise of sustainability through reductionism. So we would build less, but we'd give more. For example, take out the car park, because you're next to so many forms of public transport, save $750,000, put in the highest ratio of bikes to apartments in the country, reduce everyone's apartment price by $35,000, where you were going to put the driveway and the roller door. Instead of putting those in, we put in a wine shop. We sold the wine shop for $425,000 and then spent $300,000 of that on an incredible rooftop garden and a rooftop laundry, and then spent the other $125,000 on upgrading all of the glazing throughout the building to the best double glazing doors and windows that money could buy in the country at the time. We got the building rating out at over 7.5 stars, and then we sold it under market. And 22 of 24 of the apartments were sold to owner-occupiers. And the idea was that we would build community there. But what we learned out of that whole process was that the Commons is a great building, but it's not great because of the architecture. It's great because of the principles that we set down at the start of the project. So Bonnie Herring, the project architect, is an incredible architect, yes. But the Commons is no incredible kind of architectural design piece. It's a set of precedent studies that were carried out across the world, looking at Baugruppen projects in Berlin, or co-housing projects in Switzerland or in Vienna, to find out how you deliver good medium density housing. And we just applied those learnings in Melbourne. We wanted to make that model replicable, and so it had to be financially, socially and ecologically sustainable. And to do that, we had to democratise the capital, because the problem as architects working in this city is that we've been engaged by all sorts of people. So our property developers that normally engage us, a property developer in this city is not someone with any experience in the built environment. They're not urban designers, they're not architects. They're people with money, and they engage development managers, architects, sales agents, architects, all the consultants, and they deliver, what do they call it? Product for profit. And what we're interested in is delivering housing for people, two very different things. So the idea was that we would democratise the capital, and that we would, instead of just chasing an outcome which is maximising profit, instead we would say we have to deliver sustainability, we have to deliver community, and we have to deliver affordability. And essentially Nightingale is is a housing model that delivers housing at cost, and that we buy the cost of capital off these people here at 15% per annum, which I think is a good return. This graph shows what Nightingale costs to deliver and what a standard development model costs to deliver. And the difference is the value to purchases. And the value to purchases in Nightingale 1, our recently completed project in Brunswick, was just over $100,000. So we sold apartments in Brunswick $100,000 under market. And I'll explain why. And I'll explain why. And when you're selling something in the marketplace $100,000 cheaper and arguably better than anything else in the marketplace, you can see why our wait list has grown from 11 people to 8,000 people. So we buy the land for the same price as a property developer. We engage our consultants and our architects for the same price as a property developer. But we don't engage a marketing team. We don't build a display suite. We don't engage a real estate agent. And our construction price is actually the same as a developer would generally pay to build a building with a car park and with air conditioners on all the balconies, and that leaks and that's poorly insulated. And our building costs about the same, but we don't have a car park, we don't have air conditioning. Instead, the building's rated out at over 7.5 stars. They're carbon neutral, they're triple and double glazed, they're cross-ventilated, they've got simple things like passive solar design. They're built of things like recycled bricks and mortar, not flammable cladding. And so it tends to cost a little bit more to build them, but we build less, so it costs about the same. And then we cap the cost of equity return at 15%, with a standard cost to a property developer, or the standard return to a property developer, ideally would be, historically, 35% internal rate of return, and currently 25% internal rate of return, but at the moment, I think anyone would be taking anything in this market, wouldn't they? I don't know. So in the Commons, when we projected, in Nightingale 1, we projected the saving per apartment would be about $87,000 an apartment. And when the valuations came back in, it was actually, they were over $100,000 cheaper per apartment for the two-bedders. We have a restrictive covenant which runs with those properties. So if we're going to deliver something that's $100,000 under market, what we don't want to do is for those people to then go and sell it tomorrow, make $100,000 and go and buy, a new four-wheel drive or something. That's not our intent. So instead, the restrictive covenant runs with the property so that when it gets resold back to the Nightingale wait list at the price that the people paid for it, plus the indexing of housing in that suburb. So this is the Commons, the first project that we did. You can see it's very close to the train line. These are the people that bought into the Commons. And interestingly, the actual early adopters into this whole model, Ursula, 65, Marianne, 61, Mike, who's not in there, just turned 60. So it was baby boomers that were our actual real early adopters. But as we've gone into Nightingale 1, we've actually got 85% of people aged 35 years and under. And interestingly, 30% of those don't have a driver's license. They either don't know how to drive or don't drive, aren't able to. The rooftop at the Commons. And then across the road from the Commons is Nightingale 1. So we tried to find a site that would be very close to the Commons to build Nightingale 1, the new financial model. And the idea was that a community on its own is fantastic, but when you have two communities opposite each other, other things start to happen. So both the resident groups from Nightingale and the Commons lobbied the City of Moreland to close the end of Florence Street and turn it into a park. So from a car park to a park. And last April, the council agreed to close the street. And so there are now two pocket parks, one on the north side, one on the south side of the street. And when this developer sells his apartments, and they've been trying to sell them for 2 years now, but when they actually finally sell them, and they build their apartment building in there, then Moreland will pull up the asphalt and plant trees and grass at the end of the street, which we think is a better outcome for everyone in Brunswick. If you've been to this part of Brunswick, there's no trees anywhere. But if you like asphalt, it's awesome. The inside of Nightingale 1 has this sense of urban generosity. So it's got this, idea of a paved bluestone lane in the middle. In around the corner there is a disabled toilet and an ambulant toilet, which is open during the day. So the building gets opened up at 7 a.m. in the morning by the cafe and closed at 6 p.m. at night by the architect. So people get to use this. So people bring their kids, sit out in the street, in the pocket park, and use this as a public amenity, which isn't provided by the City of Moreland. There's moments to stop and talk and meet your neighbours. The Nightingale Housing Office is in here, behind a not-for-profit cafe. That not-for-profit cafe trains homeless people and then works with Launch Housing to house them, so it takes them from homelessness into employment and into accommodation. And then on the weekends, Home One, the cafe, then occupies the Nightingale Housing Office, and the residents can also come and use the Nightingale Housing Office. So that space isn't just used 8 hours a day, it's used more like 15 hours a day and 7 days a week. This is the residents of the Commons and Nightingale coming together in the street, putting some bollards out across the street on a sunny day, dragging their rooftop furniture down in the lift, and just having a big lunch on a Sunday afternoon, totally on an ad hoc basis. That's my wife in there. She started that day. That's her fault, in the dark glasses and the hat. And then the idea was that we would open source this model and that we would share it with other architects around the country and try and replicate this model. So this is Nightingale 2 by 6 degrees. This is currently under construction in Fairfield. This will be completed in February next year. And so the Commons is 7.5 stars. And we couldn't make, when we finished the Commons in 2013, we couldn't afford the technology to make it carbon neutral. Every Nightingale building now has to be carbon neutral, fossil fuel free. You can't plumb gas into any of our buildings. Nightingale 2 is 8.2 stars. It has 18 kilowatts of solar. Sorry, Nightingale 1. Nightingale 2 is 8.7 stars. So it's, better. It's more efficient than Nightingale 1. And then Nightingale 3 is kind of duking it out, trying to get a better thermal efficiency than Nightingale 2. We'll see how that goes. It's Nightingale 3 on Sydney Road, Brunswick, and this is the back of the building, which opens up onto Saxon Street. Nightingale Brunswick East, currently under construction. Finishes in June next year, Dom. And then Nightingale Village, 7 architects building 7 carbon neutral communities in Brunswick, 2 streets south of the Commons. And so we all came together as a group, and Kim and Jesse sitting over here, you can talk to them later if you want. They're working with Fontic, the development managers, helping bring 7 architects together to raise $18.5 million between them to buy this site, which was a challenge because we've all got, there's like 300 different investors across 7 different companies and 7 different architects doing this. And the idea is we build 7 different communities. There's 700 bikes across this precinct. There's 20 cars, and they're all go-get share cars. And those share cars, are going to range from people movers to moving vans to pet-friendly vehicles to hatchbacks. And of course, we're going to try and make them go all EV. And then up-and-coming housing models, we're working with different church organisations around the country. We're looking at Baugruppen, so how to bring that German model here, which is essentially about getting people to engage in their community first and use their deposits to reduce the cost of equity across their projects. And this is an example of a Baugruppen project in Berlin. It's called Big Yard, and it's largely about families who have kids. They came together as a group, pre-assembled, and they face all of their apartments in instead of out. So all the living rooms face in instead of all the bedrooms facing in. It's totally counterintuitive as an architect. But all the living rooms open out onto this figure 8 kind of racetrack, and all these kids kind of rush out here, and there's this incredible kind of thing you can watch on YouTube with just kids running around infinitely on the running track until they go into their own homes. And, how do we use the Baugruppen model? And so when we did this diagram, Landcorp hadn't even started that in WA with Jeffrey London, but the great thing is that's actually underway now in Western Australia. So it's finally coming here now. And we modelled it that it would save people about $25,000 per apartment in Melbourne by involving the people early. We're interested in land for best use, and the interesting thing is that what we're finding in dealing with government authorities is that they have this, Ken and I have talked about it, state government authorities have to return a financial return back to their departments, and so they keep on referring to this term highest and best use. And I keep on finding that what that actually means is the highest dollar, and it's never about the best possible use. We're looking at ground lease models, and so we're working with church groups, running some pilot projects, which is essentially church groups putting in their land for free, essentially, but we're leasing the air rights above that in perpetuity, or a 99-year lease, which would then, it's a rolling lease. And so we're looking at a model in Sydney where we can build studio apartments in Sydney, in Marrickville, 300 metres from the train station, for $330 a week, which is incredibly, I know it sounds expensive by Melbourne terms, but everyone's gobsmacked about how cheap it is in Sydney. And then ground floor tenancies, the most important thing that we can do is how do we engage with the residents and how do we engage back to the broader community? I mean, we've all, been up High Street, Northcote, Preston, Thornbury or Nicholson Street or Lygon Street or Sydney Road. And what happens is that in a residential development, the planning scheme calls for the bottom floor to be commercial space. But it's the last thing that the developer thinks about selling. So they focus on selling all the apartments. And then the way the building touches the ground is a sea of aluminium glass shop fronts that are vacant. And it leaves this feeling of destitution throughout our cities. And so one of the most important things, and the example that Ken showed of the R50 model, the Baugruppen project in Berlin, is that that group of residents came together and said, what can we do with that? So we can use that space for a number of things. We could house a refugee family in it. We can have a shared kitchen in there. We can put a gallery in there. So people who are living in the buildings actually thinking about how they touch the ground and how they engage back out with the street. And to do that, they need to be involved in the financial decisions about how much does that retail tenancy actually cost. So we're now working with the residents of Nightingale Brunswick East to bring Home One, that not-for-profit cafe, into the ground floor. The rent on that is $50,000 a year, and the residents are looking at paying $20,000 of that a year, because between all of the residents, it's $10 a week each, or 2 coffees each. So Home One have agreed to give all the residents 2 coffees each a week. The residents have agreed to pay $20,000 a year. Home One now only pays 60% of that rent, and then their volunteers can staff the cafe the rest of the time. Home One have then said that the residents can use the cafe anytime they want. So they close at 4 p.m, and the residents get to use it every night for whatever they want. And Home One have also agreed to cook them dinner once a month as a group. So it's an incredible outcome with everyone working together. And then obviously looking at co-living models. And the interesting thing is the co-living model is not actually new. Like in 1910, there were bachelor apartments in New York where there was a big dining room. They were actually called bachelor apartments, and single guys used to live there. And they could all come together, sit down in a big dining hall, and they'd all dine together. And so there was no kitchens in any of their apartments. So their apartments were quite small, really efficient. This is, again, co-living in New York, where you have smaller apartments with a kitchenette and a bathroom, but then big shared community areas, big shared kitchens and dining areas, a shared library. There's a community curator that actually organises connections and events for everyone to get to know each other. Long-term rental. One of the problems we've got at the moment is long-term rental in Melbourne at the moment looks very, very expensive, whereas long-term rental in Berlin, this is one of the Baugruppen projects, is much, much cheaper, or co-housing projects in Switzerland, incredibly affordable. Shared equity models. How can people with money help other people buy houses? So we're looking at a shared equity scheme. We used to have one in this state in the 80s. The state government's trialling another one, but they've got limitations on what type of housing you can buy. There's a shared equity scheme in Western Australia. There's a shared equity scheme in South Australia, but we don't have one currently in Victoria. So I guess our next move at Nightingale will be to design and build a shared equity scheme if the state won't do it. Giving back. Nightingale is, like I said, financially transparent. It's housing delivered at cost. At the end of Nightingale 1, the construction contingency that we didn't spend, we gave back to the residents. So we gave the residents back a cheque for $109,000 that we hadn't spent on the build. And we thought that they would spend it on some kind of community arts instigation project, and they just refunded like $5,000 to all the residents, and people just bought like a new TV or something like that. Yeah, not the outcome that we'd hoped, but it's a democracy. And then good money. So what we've found is that when we first started the Nightingale project, it was nearly impossible for us to get finance. To get construction finance for Nightingale 1, I had to speak to 34 different banks, and I counted them. And in the end, we ended up with an impact investment group out of Sydney called SEFA, Social Enterprise Finance Australia, that had to build a lending syndicate to lend us $6 million. So basically there were 6 parties to the lending syndicate, and they all put in $1 million each to limit their risk on delivering a project that was delivered at cost. We're now working on Nightingale Village, and we're finding that I've met with a CEO of one of the big four banks twice. I mean, that's, you know, interesting. Not that I ever would have wanted to talk to one of the big four banks before. And the first question I asked them was about their investment in Adani, their divestment from fossil fuels, and they talked to me about their orderly exit from those markets. And they assured me that they had no lendings in Adani before we even started talking about anything else. But it's interesting that since we've started to do this, that we're now seeing superannuation companies, green bonds, so good money, impact investors turning up saying, how can we fund projects like Nightingale? Thank you very much.